Hello, everyone. Meteorologist Mia Montgomery here with the lovely
meteorologist Sarah Spivey. Thank you for that lovely comment.
You're very welcome. And we are here with our next Whatever the Weather episode. I'm excited about this one because I feel like a lot of folks have been asking questions about what does the winter season look like for us here in San Antonio, especially after such a hot and dry summer, right?
Absolutely. And, we have an interesting thing happening this winter, which is a triple dip La Niña.
Yes.
And it hasn't happened all that much in recorded history.
Yes.
Basically, we're in a La Niña weather pattern for the third winter in a row. So we wanted to talk about that and what it could potentially do with our weather later on down the line.
Exactly. So we'll kind of just jump into the topic itself, and then, we'll talk about exactly what you just said, what can we really expect going forward, especially after what we've already seen this summer, just lack of rainfall and everything like that. So we can start with just what does it mean to be in this so-called triple dip La Niña. And so to talk about La Niña, we first need to understand what we call ENSO, E-N-S-O, and that essentially is a big acronym for the El Niño Southern Oscillation Cycle. And so in this ENSO cycle, you have three phases. You have El Niño, you have La Niña, and then you have ENSO neutral, which is neither El Niño or La Niña. So basically, this cycle has to do with the temperature of the water in the Pacific Ocean and how those warm or cold waters can essentially impact and drive our weather patterns here in the United States and here in Texas. Is actually really fascinating.
Right. So whatever happens to the ocean happens to the atmosphere. The
Yes.
ocean influences the atmosphere.
It's a big driver of where we see patterns, the jet stream that we always talk about in the meteorological world and things like that. So during a normal winter, so we'll call this ENSO neutral, which remember is neither La Niña or El Niño, there are winds at the equator. We call those trade winds, and essentially they are blowing westward along the equator in the Pacific Ocean. And so these winds typically take an amount of warm water from South America and they blow them across the ocean closer to the Asia area. And so when you have some of that warm water that's being transported farther to the west, something has to come up and replace that warm water at the surface. So that's when we see some colder water from the depths of the Pacific then come back up to replace that warm water that's been shoved westward. We call that process upwelling, and we typically see that in hurricanes and tropical storms and stuff just because winds are churning up that water beneath them. Now during a La Niña year, those winds are stronger than usual, so we're seeing a higher amount of that warm water being shoved westward, so essentially more cold water is upwelling to take its place. And that then pushes the jet stream, which is one of the drivers of weather patterns that we see here across the United States, farther northward, which means for us here in the southern U.S., a lot of those systems stay north. They don't really make it as far south as we would like them to, especially when we've had a summer without a whole lot of beneficial rainfall. So typically for us, that means that we see warmer and drier than average conditions.
less cold fronts,
less, exactly, low pressure systems that bring a lot of rain events and things like that because they just don't travel as far south when the jet stream is pushed farther northward. So especially now that we've had 3 La Niña winters in a row, I mean, that's just warmer and drier than average conditions typically than what we would like to see, back to back to back. So of course, it affects different parts of the United States differently as well. When there is La Niña conditions and the jet stream is farther northward, that's when you see those rain systems and cooler than average temperatures up north, like in the Pacific Northwest, because that's who's seeing more of those systems roll through. So it's important to note that, according to NOAA, which is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, that El Niño generally occurs more frequently than La Niña. But obviously we've known that not to be the case here over the past 3 years, which I think speaks volumes into how rare a triple dip La Nina can be. And so to go along with that, Sarah, we have a quote from Dr. Nielsen Gammon.
Right. Dr. Nielsen Gammon he actually is at Texas A&M. He taught us, but he's also the state climatologist for the state of Texas. And so climatology, when we talk about climatology, we're talking about long periods of weather and averages. And so he studies these things and is an expert on these things. And the question we asked him is, how will this potentially impact the nation's drought, being in a third straight La Nina winter? Now, Mia, you mentioned that during La Nina, it is typically drier and warmer.
Yes.
So we don't get as much winter rain. Now, we don't get a ton of winter rain anyway, but we don't get enough. And every little bit of that rain from winter and spring helps us out in the summer when it is very dry. And so we've had 3 dry winters in a row. And that is all kind of really built up. And so when asking this question to Dr. NG, Nielsen Gammon, about how it will potentially impact the nation's drought, he says, since this is only the second recorded 3-year La Nina, triple dip La Nina, we don't have a lot of past history to go on. However, the impact of last year's La Nina is felt in the extended drought that still remains in place for most of Texas. Because we have started the winter dry, and because La Nina tends to lead to dry winters, we're looking at a prolonged drought. And as drought persists, the impacts on water supplies tend to increase. Reservoir storage is already lower statewide than it was this time of year. Canyon Lake, which is a lake here in south central Texas, has about 8% less water than last year, and Medina Lake is sitting at just 7% capacity. The longer the drought continues, the bigger the water supply issues, end quote. And we're going to show some pictures here of Medina Lake, which is at the time of this recording about 7% full. Again, Medina Lake's a reservoir, so farmers will tap into that water and things like that. It's not dry because it's dry outside. It's dry because the need of the water is greater. And so according to Dr. Nielsen Gammon, this is kind of just, act like a positive feedback loop in a negative way, in that we're going to have less and less rain and more need for extra water.
Yep. And that makes sense. Like when you think about La Nina and all that, I mean, it is important to note that doesn't mean we're not going to see any rain at all, right? This winter,
so important.
and it's not going to be 90 degrees outside every day. Like, yes, we still will get a couple cold snaps. We typically do find that. And yes, we will still get some rain. It's just likely at the end of the season, when we go back and we tally up the numbers, it likely will be warmer and drier than what we know is the average to be.
That's a good point, Mia. And according to the Climate Prediction Center, the CPC, they issue these outlooks every so often, and they've issued their temperature outlook for the season of winter and their precipitation outlook. And guess what? Shocker. There's a good chance that it will be warmer than average, and there is a good chance that it will be drier than average. And when we look at their drought predictions as well, there is also a good chance that drought will either persist or develop or worsen. And so we're going to show you those maps as well. There's certain parts of the country that will get more rain than usual. Mia was talking about how in a La Nina year, the northern half of the United States gets more rain. Mm-hmm. That's exactly the case in their prediction, and that it will be colder up north, and that's their prediction as well. And another question we get about La Nina is, does climate change have any impact at all?
Right.
And La Nina, ENSO, El Nino, the neutral, that is a very natural process in the atmosphere and in the oceans, okay? It happens naturally without the influence of human-caused climate change. However, climate change, I like to think of it like a seasoning on neutral,
a little sprinkle,
natural events that occur. We naturally get flooding here in south central Texas because of where we're located, but add a little bit of warmth to the atmosphere, add a little bit of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, and that enhances that flooding. It's a similar thing when it comes to things like drought and warmth, right, from a La Nina. It will exist without the influence of climate change, but with the influence of climate change, it just makes it a little bit drier or for a little bit longer and a little bit warmer.
That's a good way to put it. You're right.
Yeah.
It's just like a little enhancement.
And these things are very difficult to quantify because there's lots of variables. However, that is the scientific consensus among scientists.
Yeah, absolutely.
And a question I get too is, Mia, when are we going to get out of this La Niña?
Exactly. When is this supposed to end, right? Are we just going to see La Niña conditions forever? Well, according to NOAA, forecasters, they're saying that it is likely, of course, that these La Niña conditions will persist through the winter season, so essentially through February of 2024. And then they're saying that they do predict a transition.
2023.
2023. I'm already a year ahead, clearly. Sorry, February of 2023. And then they predict a transition to INSO-neutral conditions, what we were talking about earlier, which is favored from February to April of 2023. Since this podcast episode was first recorded, NOAA and the Climate Prediction Center actually released an updated INSO outlook. Essentially, a return to INSO neutral conditions is still probable after this winter season, but now odds are favoring potentially El Niño development by the end of this year. And if we were to see El Niño conditions develop for us here in South Central Texas, that would mean cooler and wetter than average conditions, which is different than La Niña, which is the warmer and drier conditions. So of course we will monitor trends over the next several months and we'll keep you updated.
There we go.
Yeah.
All right. Well, again, it's just a waiting game, but here's the thing, it always changes. So there is going to be some point that we will go into INSO neutral, and there will be some point that we will go into El Niño. So it's just a waiting game. And the great thing is that South Central Texas, San Antonio, we're used to drought, and so we have a lot of resources when it comes to drought. You know, the San Antonio Botanical Gardens has a great program to make sure that you have water conservation plants in your backyard. You don't have to water as much. So we have the tools to deal with this, which is really good.
Yes.
But great questions about La Niña, triple dip La Niña. Hope this answered your questions. And just a reminder that the Whatever the Weather podcast is also a video podcast, so you can watch it. You can see all those images that we were talking about earlier, the maps, those kinds of things. You can watch it on ksat.com and on YouTube as well. And so, again, we're doing a blog too, a weather blog, right?
Yep, and it's just a really cool way for us to kind of talk about the weather, but in a more casual sense. I mean, we dive into so many different topics.
Mm-hmm.
So we have that up, and we're always updating that. We're trying to do as many as we can in a given week. So
absolutely,
it's really cool.
So whether we're in an El Niño, an INSO neutral, or a triple dip La Niña, remember to
weather the weather, whatever the weather.